Hey guys, what's happening? Aaron here. Well, moving right along with the final year. Up next, we have probably one of my, I wouldn't say all-time favorites, but definitely a classic on the original Nintendo. Talking about, of course, Dragon Warrior. Or if you live outside North America, Dragon Quest. Now this is one of those games where, obviously growing up, my friends and I, we didn't really get that much into it because we didn't really understand that it was a different type of genre than we were normally playing. Obviously it's an RPG, one of the first RPGs I remember playing. And it was funny because we, back when you're a kid, everything about, fantasy or, adventure and things like that, it all gets kind of jumbled together. So we just kind of treated it like another adventure Nintendo game, really. And it was a lot of fun because it's a very super simple game, but it used to take us so much time. We put so many hours into it, just trying to beat it. It was ridiculous. And a lot of the times I remember, we would rent it on a Friday night, and it would literally take us all the way until Sunday afternoon to even get close to getting to the end. And sometimes we wouldn't even do that. Sometimes we wouldn't even get to the end. There were a lot of times like that too, but I mean, again, we were just kids, so what did we know? So other than that, sit back and relax and enjoy my review of Dragon Warrior. Thanks for watching.
When remembering my childhood and growing up in the 80s, there's tons of great memories. Speaking specifically about being a video gamer in the 80s and the rise of Nintendo, there were plenty of great games that were created. Some were just one-offs, like Operation Wolf. Others would go on to create franchises, with games still being produced to this day, almost 30 years later. One game in particular I always remember from being a kid is Dragon Warrior, otherwise known everywhere else in the world as Dragon Quest. The original game was released in 1986 in Japan on the Famicom, but wouldn't arrive here in America until 1989, over 3 years later, on the NES. Which is crazy when you think about it in terms of release dates nowadays. Can you imagine if, say, the next Final Fantasy game came out in Japan this year, but wouldn't be released here in America till 2021? Of course, things were a lot less interconnected back then than they are now. Most of the time back then, we had no idea what games were coming out, unless we were told so in Nintendo Power. So by the time Dragon Warrior came out, we were already in grade school. Released in 1989, Dragon Warrior was created and released by Enix, again before the merger with Squaresoft. It was intended as an easier introduction to newer gamers to the RPG genre, and along with the original Final Fantasy, was really responsible for bringing the RPG genre to American audiences in a much more broader way. I mean, yeah, there's always been Dungeons & Dragons, and Ultima, and a few others like that, but nothing that really allowed gamers to explore the genre. Let's be honest, when you're 9 years old, you don't really want to play a long, drawn-out journey adventure title, or at least we didn't. We grew up on Mario jumping around and stomping on enemies, shooting bad guys and grappling around in Bionic Commando, or running and gunning in Mega Man. Then my friend rented this new game for the weekend, and we literally spent the entire weekend in his basement. Not that we normally didn't growing up, but this was different. This was a game you couldn't just sit down and play through for an hour, then go on to something else. Oh no. This game took hours to even make a decent dent in its adventure, with tons of battles, weapons and items, enemies, and battle tactics to work through. We'd never seen or played anything like it before. True, like I mentioned before, Final Fantasy was released by this time, but for some reason, we never played it growing up. I mean, I obviously did later in life, as Final Fantasy has become one of my favorite game series of all time. But getting back on track. The game takes place in a world called Elefgard, with the player taking on the role of hero. Yes, as is the case with many early RPG titles, the main character is not named, but in turn is left up to the player to name as they want. Legend tells of another legendary hero named Erdrick, who saved the land from a past evil. This piece was represented by a ball of light. Yes, I know, very in-depth and original. Erdrick then disappeared and was never heard from again. Over time, as the kingdom prospered, one guy didn't really like the way things were going, and one day, while exploring a cave, he came upon a dragon. Instead of mauling him and eating his heart for lunch, the dragon became his little pet. So the guy renamed himself Dragon Lord and set about causing havoc and all sorts of shit to go down. He steals the ball of light, as well as the king's daughter, Lady Laura. Thus, the hero appears in front of the king and is sent on his journey. Time to kick some slime ass! Now, let's get something straight. As I've mentioned in a lot of my other NES reviews, Dragon Warrior is very sparse. Meaning, the general layout of the game is very simple. The graphics are simple. The storyline is simple. The rest is up to the player to use something called your imagination. Yes, I know that's something that almost doesn't exist in a lot of modern gamers anymore. But 30 years ago, using your brain to fill in the world with all sorts of stuff is a lot of what made these types of games so much fun back then, growing up. So you start in Tentacle Castle, get some basic information from the king, some basic supplies and gold, and off you go. You make your way around the land, entering towns, talking to townsfolk, you know, the usual RPG shit. In these towns, you also have the ability to purchase new weapons and armor to help you along your way. While running around the countryside, you'll encounter random enemy battles, another RPG staple. These monsters take many forms, but most recognizable and nearly legendary enemy from the game at this point is the slime! You'll run into these fuckers all over the place, and it's pretty much the most common enemy you'll face throughout the game. The slimes come in a few variations, most notably, the Metal Slime! Urgh! Now, don't be fooled by these little fuckers and their smiley faces. These bastards are sneaky. They get sneaky as fuck! You think it's all good? And they're friendly and whatnot, and BAM! They'll kick your ass in a heartbeat. One of the nice things about Dragon Warrior is that, in relation to random enemy encounters, and unlike Final Fantasy, enemies only attack one-on-one. Thus, you never really have to worry about being overtaken by a group of goblins or some other mob of baddies. True, the player only has one character to play with, so that kind of makes sense. The world itself is not that big, but when you're a kid, you don't know shit about video games. It used to take us an entire weekend to make it to the end. No shit. Luckily, the North American version of the game has a battery backup built into it. Japanese players had to use a password system. Speaking of which, I think this is the first game I remember fondly as being one of the first major games growing up where we literally had pages and pages of notes. Information, items, weapons, everything. Everything had to be written down, kids. Yes, that's right. Think you could make it through a dungeon or cave without drawing a map? Kiss your ass goodbye! Especially that one fucking cave next to the ocean. You know the one. The one where if you try to be a smartass and just make a beeline for the boss of the game, you'll get poisoned and dead in a split second. And this game doesn't fuck around either. When you enter a cave and say you don't have a torch or the correct spell to illuminate the area, the only thing you see is just the square around the character. That's it. Not the whole area is just darkened or you may have a difficult time seeing without a torch, or no. You see your character, and that's it. Now, with enough playthroughs and our increased intelligence brought on by getting older, my friends and I eventually did memorize how to get through this specific cave even by skipping a large chunk of the game. But holy hell, before then, kiss your ass goodbye! Eventually, after running around the whole world, and pretty much only venturing about 60 steps from the main castle, and the start of the game... Yeah, the end of the game, and the boss castle is literally right across the river from where you start the game. This revelation just blew our minds when we figured it out. Of course, this caused us to spend an entire day attempting to speedrun the game at 9 years old, but of course, the game designers were way smarter than us, and made it so this wasn't possible. Or, at least, it wasn't without a game genie, bitch! You kick the Dragon Lord's ass, rescue the princess, game over. Easy peasy. On the graphics side of things, it's pretty standard fare as far as NES games go. There's very simple 2-frame animation for characters and townsfolk, and other than text boxes or enemy windows popping up, there really isn't too much else in the way of your basic overhead questing game. Colors are pretty nice, but the game overall does have a limited color palette, as many colors are reused for enemies and other objects scattered about. The enemy designs are actually pretty decent for being a pretty simple NES game. There isn't a very big variety of enemies you'll face throughout your journey. Many are just recolored and called a different iteration of the original enemy, but again, that's okay. It's part of the game's charm. The audio side is, again, very simple in its presentation. It's your standard fantasy Zelda-ish types of music, but there's only a handful. I usually like the town music the best though, as it's very happy sounding and makes you want to go on an adventure. Unlike a lot of the other adventure fantasy games of the time, the overworld music in this game does kinda irk me a little bit. It's a little too repetitive, but what are you gonna do? Overall, Dragon Warrior is, or was, one of my most memorable games from my childhood on the NES. As I previously mentioned, my friends and I never really played or got into Final Fantasy back then, so this game I'll always remember as pretty much being my first introduction to the RPG genre. Does it stand up well over these past 30 years? I'd say so. It has its charm if you go into it with nothing else than it's a fantasy adventure game on the NES. That's all. There was a remake of the game released on the Game Boy Color in 1999, which I've never played, and there was also a remake released on the Super Famicom in Japan. I'd never even heard about that remake until I was writing this review. Dragon Quest, as it's known outside of America, has gone on to have one of the longest running franchises in video game history. It's been praised by fans and critics alike. There were 3 additional sequels released on the NES back in the day, with Dragon Warrior 2, 3, and 4. I've never played any of those either, but I always thought growing up that the box covers look really cool, especially Dragon Warrior 4. Unfortunately, the Dragon Quest series hasn't been that popular over here in the States, whereas in Japan, the franchise still thrives to this day. There was around a 17-year gap between Dragon Quest 4 and 5 being released here in the States, between 1992 and 2009. Yeah. Luckily, with the release of Dragon Quest V on the Nintendo DS, the naming scheme was corrected, as was the case with other Japanese English releases back in the early days of gaming. Also, again, the release timeline was all fucked up as well, just like Final Fantasy was back in the 90s. Dragon Warrior 4 was released in 1992, then, in 1997, we got Dragon Quest VII. Like, what the fuck? Where did 5 and 6 go? Oh, no, we wouldn't get those for another decade. So this is how the release timeline goes for us here in the States. Dragon Quest 1, 2, 3, and 4, then 7, then 8, then 5 and 6, then 9, Or no, wait, I fucked up. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, then 7, 8, then 5, then 9, then fucking 6. Holy shit. So Dragon Quest VI on the Nintendo DS was the last release we saw here in the States in 2011. Even though Dragon Quest X and 11 have already been released in Japan. Talk about a fucked up release chronology. Anyways, if you've never played the original on the NES, and you're into RPG games, give it a chance. It's one of the all-time classics on the system, and along with Final Fantasy, really paved the way for role-playing games in mainstream America, outside of computer games. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, go check it out.